Hi, and welcome to a flipped lecture. I'm Mr. Wahlberg. This is episode 5 of Period 4. Period 4 is early America. Period 5 is the era of good feelings. We have 3 objectives. You should be able to identify the social basis for the flourishing of democracy in the early mid-19th century. You should be able to describe the efforts made in this period to strengthen the economic integration of the nation, identify the major crises that hindered these efforts. You should be able to identify the major areas of conflict between nationalism and sectionalism. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 10. Now here we do a little bit of a preview. This is a bit of foreshadowing with how the rest of the period is going to go. And we look at the state of Rhode Island. Right? State of Rhode Island, the smallest state, had property qualifications for voting in 1841. They were one of the last states to have those kinds of qualifications. They're specifically limiting people to voting property holders. You had to own property in the state to vote there. And Rhode Island was one of the last ones to do that. Now, because propertyless wage earners, or basically factory workers, and you remember, of course, this is the time that factories are being built, and so these factory workers, they couldn't vote, and so the state's labor movement pushed for reform at an organization known as the People's Convention, in 1841. This convention didn't have legal standing. They weren't like a constitutional convention or so, but they did. They adopted a new state constitution which enfranchised all white men. Now, there was also a movement to enfranchise African Americans, but they caved to pressure, and so the People's Convention just pushed for white people there. And the reformers inaugurated a guy named Thomas Dorr, who's here in our bottom left corner. Thomas Dorr was inaugurated as governor, which meant that even though the People's Convention didn't have legal standing to do so, they did create a new constitution, a new government, and a new governor, which meant that there were 2 rival governments at the same time. And President Tyler, who, as of this moment in the PowerPoint, isn't president yet, but President Tyler sent in federal troops to put down the movement, and the Dorr movement collapsed, and Thomas Dorr spent 2 years in jail, 2 years in prison for it. Subpoint B. In 1831, a French diplomat named Alcide de Tocqueville, he was a diplomat and a historian. Today we'd call him a political science, but that classification didn't exist back then. He toured to the United States, ostensibly to study prisons, but really to study American democracy. You'll have to remember that Tocqueville came in a time where a huge amount of turmoil was going on in France. The French Republic collapsed in 1815. They restored Louis XVIII. That was the Bourbon Restoration, which collapsed on its own. In 1830, they put in the Second Republic, and the Second Republic turned into the Second Empire, and later the Third Republic. And anyway, Tocqueville lives in this era of extreme political chaos in France, and he came to the United States to go figure out what was the magic, what's the secret sauce that's going on in this new country where democracy seems to succeed rather than fail upon itself. He was particularly impressed with America's commitment to equality, but he also worried that Americans overvalued individualism. And here we refer back to the people that we met in our last class, Thoreau and Emerson, and their praise of individualism. Tocqueville was a little more skeptical of American individuality, saying that maybe Americans have lost their ability to be together as Americans together, because those high levels of equality and individualism meant there was no middle class of society. Here we're not talking about an economic middle class, but like a social middle class, to mediate between the people that have power in the government and the people that don't have power in just like the public. And he says that basically that commitment to individuality means that we've given up that mediating class, which is part of the reason it works, but it was also something that Tocqueville couldn't quite figure out about what was going on in the United States. And he really worried that eventually the United States would have a tyranny of the majority, which was a claim not unknown to the founders, that perhaps mob rule wouldn't be a good way to run a country, that would have a whole bunch of people want a bad idea at the same time. And so Tocqueville was skeptical of that. As the founders also feared excessive influence by ordinary people, and that's why we see that they come up with this idea of like an electoral college, a mediating institution between what's the will of the people and who's actually going to become the president, or things like the Senate, which at the time wasn't even directly elected by the people. There was kind of like, again, a mediating level, because there's all these protections against the mob rule. Anyway, Tocqueville was pretty impressed by much of what he saw in American life. He admired the stability of the economy, the popularity of the churches, and he noted the irony, and this irony isn't lost on us moderns today, that the freedom-loving nation's mistreatment of Native Americans, and saying that Americans love freedom yet have slavery. Subpoint C. By 1840, more than 90% of adult white men were eligible to vote, and democratic political institutions came to define the nation's sense of its own identity. And here you see that the Americanness is tied up not in ethnic lines, not in territorial claims or pieces of geography. But what makes Americans American is the commitment to the democratic institutions. It is a country of a philosophical commitment rather than a territorial or geographic or ethnic or bloodline countries. And this becomes the big, and this still carries on today. What do Americans like most about being American? It's the sense of freedom that Americans think is the thing that defines them. With persistent pressure from those excluded from political participation, democracy, at least for white males, had triumphed for the age of Jackson. Subpoint D. The market revolution and the growing political democracy produced an expansion of the public sphere and an explosion in printing. There was a technological change which allowed steam printing to produce mass-produced periodicals, newspapers, faster and cheaper than they ever had been. This was referred to as the penny press. The penny press newspapers, they were cheap. They were these tabloid-style newspapers mass-produced in the United States from the 1830s onwards. Now, these mass production of inexpensive newspapers became possible because of the shift from hand-powered printing into steam-powered printing. The penny press, while it did expand journalism, it did expand news and circulation, it also came at the cost of sensationalism, crime stories, exposés, and things that aren't really news. Reduction in printing costs made it also possible, though, to have alternative newspapers, and I think that we would say this is good in the marketplace of ideas. Alternative newspapers by people that live on the margins, people of color, labor, abolitionists, people that wouldn't have access to mainstream printing. Suddenly, with lower input costs, they reach a national voice. Roman numeral number 9. Fighting a draw after the War of 1812 led to a burst of national pride, and a new manufacturing sector emerged from the war. And a lot of people believe it was necessary to complement the agricultural sector for national growth. You couldn't just be a country of farmers, that it also needed to have some industry to it as well. In 1815, President James Madison put forward a blueprint for government-promoted economic development. It became known as the American system, and it included things like a new national bank and tariffs to protect American industry to raise funds, and federal financing for internal improvements like better roads and canals. And these are very much Hamiltonian issues, which Madison was not in support of later in his career. But having fought in the War of 1812, he sees the importance of a national bank. And the new creation of industry, suddenly tariffs look like a pretty good idea. Madison bailed on the third plank of that, though, the internal improvements like better roads and canals, believing that, if the ability if you're going to make roads and canals, all this stuff has to cost money, and the power to tax is the power to destroy. And so he was less interested in doing that, and also thought it was more of a job of the states. Subpoint B. Henry Clay of Kentucky led the National Republicans in an 1816 sponsored legislation that created the Second Bank of the United States, and he persuaded Madison to sign it. The Bank of the United States was a profit-making corporation to serve the government. The Bank of the United States had branches in several states. Now, local banks, not the bus, but local banks were the ones actually printing the money. This is a complicated thing, and it doesn't really get sorted out in like American economic conditions for quite some time. But your local banks printed their money, and they had these. The value of that paper money currency fluctuated wildly, and you could imagine this, that if every bank is printing their own currency, it would be hard to find a consistency between what that paper money would do. The Bank of the United States was there to prevent the overissuance of money and try to hold off inflationary risk. It could demand payment in gold and silver from its local banks. Subpoint C. A lot of people oppose the Bank of the United States for various reasons, including the belief that it was an improper tool for the federal government, that it was outside what the government should actually be doing. The Maryland legislature adopted an act imposing a tax on all banks in the state that were not chartered by the state legislature. They tried to force the Maryland branch of the Bank of the United States to pay taxes to the state. On its face, this was all about tax collection. In reality, this was about an attempt to destroy the Bank of the United States, at least within Maryland. The Bank of the United States, the bus, refused to pay that tax, and McCulloch ended up getting sued for noncompliance with Maryland state tax law. McCulloch admitted he wasn't complying with Maryland's law, but said that he didn't. He admitted there was never any question that he wasn't complying with the nation's law, but said it was an unjust tax anyway. With the state law. It said it was an unjust tax. McCulloch lost in the Baltimore County Court, which was kind of expected. And then he lost in the Maryland Supreme Court, which was kind of expected. And the case was eventually taken up by the United States Supreme Court with the question, does Congress have the ability to establish a bank in the United States under the Constitution? Or can Congress even make the bus that now Maryland is trying to destroy? Well, Chief Justice John Schwarzenegger Marshall, wrote the unanimous opinion of the court. And he writes, Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper to carry out Congress's powers. And he uses Hamilton's idea of a broad constitution, or a broad construction of the Constitution. He writes, Let the ends be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and by all means which are appropriate, which are not prohibited, are constitutional. Since the Bank of the United States was a lawful instrument of specific federal authority, the law creating the bank was constitutional, and it was totally acceptable. Furthermore, Article 6 of the Constitution says the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and any laws of the state to the contrary notwithstanding. And since the power to tax involves the power to destroy, marshals of the states have no power, by taxation or otherwise, to retard, impede, or control the federal laws, and thus the law imposing a tax on the Bank of the United States is unconstitutional and void, and Maryland does not get a chance to tax the Bank of the United States. This was the next great movement towards centralizing power of the central authority and take it away from the United States, or take it away from the individual states, handing it all the way up to the federal level. And John Schwarzenegger Marshall, in his best federalist move, centralizes power again in the top of the government. So point C. The Bank of the United States participated in a speculative fever that swept across the country after the War of 1912 ended. Now, early in 1819, the European demand for American farm products returned to normal levels. And this is a predictable pattern that we could see in years after war, that eventually Europe was able to produce its own goods again and no longer demanded American goods. And so the economic bubble that looked pretty great in those years after the War of 1812 suddenly burst. Now, demand for land and prices fell. Again, this is a typical and predictable pattern, but the Bank of the United States and state banks quickly called in their loans. They demanded repayment before loan collateral lost all of its value. The Panic of 1819 disrupted the political harmony of the previous years and reinforced American distrust of banks. James Monroe's 2 terms of presidents were characterized by an absence of two-party competition, which historians referred to, and people at the time referred to it as the era of good feelings. But the absence of political party disputes was replaced by sectional disputes, where people of the North and the South and of the West would end up arguing for their section of the country to have its due, I suppose. Anyway, Missouri applied for admission to the Union as a slave state in 1819, and Congressman James Talmadge of New York proposed a ban on the importation of slaves into Missouri. And he wanted a gradual emancipation of black people in Missouri, so they would be emancipated from slavery eventually, and just end slavery in what would be this new state. Now, Missourians, in particular white people, because they're the only ones that get to vote in this, of course, while Missourians were rejecting Talmadge's proposals, the northern majority in the House of Representatives blocked the territory's admission to the Union. Now, Southerners in the Senate, the Senate basically has a balance of free and slaveholding states. And so the Southerners in the Senate say, listen, if you're going to deny Missouri admission to the Union because they won't comply with your abolitionist points of view, then we're going to deny Maine's admission to the Union because we don't want an imbalance in the Senate between slave and free states. So to underline the commitment to slavery, Southerners used their power in the Senate to withhold statehood from Maine, which was seeking to separate itself from Massachusetts. What is that? Oh, there we go. And Southerners advanced 3 constitutional arguments to do so. They raised the idea that all the states have equal rights. This is kind of a state supremacy argument, and it certainly is prefigured in the Constitution to say so, that no state is more important than any other state. That they are all equal states in the Union. And secondly, that slavery is purely an internal state affair. And you see this in the way it goes on, that like Virginia has slaves, but Pennsylvania does not, even though they're essentially neighbors of each other. So why, you could tell that slavery is not a national issue, it's a state issue, and Pennsylvania, in this example, wouldn't have any right to go tell Virginia that it needed to change its laws on slavery because this is a state issue, not a federal issue. And thirdly, the Congress had no authority to infringe on the property rights of the slaveholders. Now, all 3 of these positions are well defined in the Constitution, and if all you're looking at is the legality of the situation, then the Southerners are right. Of course, there's a bigger picture at stake, but if that's all you're looking at, then the Southerners are right. The Henry Clay finally put together a series of political agreements known collectively as the Missouri Compromise. This compromise set a precedent for the admission of states into the unions of the pairs, 1 free and 1 slave. And Southern senators accepted legislation that prohibited slavery in all of the Louisiana Purchase. Basically, they say, okay, we're going to let 1 free state and 1 slave state come in, and all of the new land that's been acquired for the Louisiana Purchase, all that's going to be free state north of the 36-degree, 30-minute line of, so 3630 north latitude, and everything above that is going to be free, and everything below it is going to be slave, except for Missouri, which is on the wrong side of the line, but that's what Missouri is going to do. The Missouri debate highlighted the westward expansion of slavery, said that this argument is not going to go away, and eventually it's going to prove hazardous to national unity. Roman numeral number 12. The United States and the Latin American Wars of Independence. Well, between 1810 and 1822, Spain's Latin American colonies rose in rebellion and established 17 different independent nations. In 1822, the Monroe administration became the first government to extend diplomatic recognition to any of these new republics. So basically, the Spanish colonies in the Americas were falling apart, and the first country to say, yeah, all those rebellions are legitimate, and you have started your own country, that was the Monroe administration, and acknowledged, basically through the power to receive ambassadors, declared that they recognized these as legitimate countries. The Wars of Independence, though, they lasted longer and they were far more destructive than the American Revolution. It was difficult to achieve any of the economic development that they had hoped for just because they were free. And so they are free countries, but they are weak and poor, and the Americans were figuring that Spain would try to go regain its colonies. And so Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who we will talk more about soon, drafted what was known as the Monroe Doctrine. He wrote it, but it was the Monroe administration, so Monroe gets credit for it. And the Monroe Doctrine declared that American continents were not subject to further colonization. In return, the United States agreed not to interfere in the internal concerns of the European nations. So basically, the Monroe Doctrine drew this line that basically says Europe is off limits to North and South America, and North and South America is off limits to Europe. You stay on your side of the ocean, we'll stay on ours, and there the twain shall meet. So that was the Monroe Doctrine. It becomes pretty important that America begins to defend the Western Hemisphere as the sphere of influence, that Europeans should stay out of it. That will become really important over the next, couple of months of APUSH. So point B. The decline of the Federalists and party politics meant there was less partisan fighting, which I think most people, most Americans think would be nice if political parties fought so little. But the Republican Party then, that party of Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, was now divided basically within itself into a national faction and a sectional faction. So the national faction, looking at the country as a whole, that was more or less led by Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams is John Adams' son. He's a fascinating guy. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about him again soon. And then there was the Jeffersonian, or the state-oriented faction. Here it's held up by Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson. The election of 1824 had 5 candidates who all called themselves Republicans. Now, Jackson was the only candidate in 1824 to have a national appeal, but all the other ones could be locally important. Congress selected William Crawford as the official candidate, but the other candidates refused to accept the selection, and they sought support among ordinary voters. John Quincy Adams campaigned on his success as Secretary of State. Henry Clay promoted the American system as his great important piece for the United States. Crawford advocated his adherence to Jeffersonian ideals. Basically, he claims party purity. And John C. Calhoun originally was running, but withdrew from the race to go support Andrew Jackson, who was a war hero, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, and a self-made man that was very much what people thought of as the quintessential American, the pull himself up by the bootstraps and go be a tough guy attitude. So Andrew Jackson received nationwide support, but no candidate received an absolute majority in the Electoral College. And so the members of the House of Representatives had to choose the president, because if you don't receive a majority in the Electoral College, it's got to go to the House to go do so. Henry Clay assembled a coalition of congressmen who would be willing to vote for John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, once he won, repaid Henry Clay by appointing him to Secretary of State. Now that was, so Henry Clay is in the House, he's arranging all of this thing, go vote for Adams, and Adams says, yeah, go vote for me, and when he gets elected, he names Henry Clay to be the new Secretary of State, and that was politically a bad idea. It was basically a politically fatal mistake for both men. John C. Calhoun accused Adams of using power and patronage of the executive to thwart the popular will, and Jacksonians in Congress condemned Henry Clay for arranging what he called the corrupt bargain. The corrupt bargain, that's a good APUSH term for you. It's basically the arrangement out of the U.S. House of Representatives that named John Quincy Adams to be the president, arranged by Henry Clay. John Quincy Adams, though, the president, he enjoyed before JQA became president, he was, I don't know that anybody has ever entered office more qualified for the job than John Quincy Adams. He, this guy had negotiated the Treaty of Ghent. He got Florida. He wrote the Monroe Doctrine. He founded the Smithsonian. He saw the American Revolution play out in his front yard. He was an ambassador to the Russians. He had spoke multiple languages, had lived in multiple countries. He was an expert in government, an expert in American democracy, and basically a who's who of a candidate. I'm not sure that anybody has come into the office more qualified than John Quincy Adams. Adams embraced the Henry Clay's American system of protective tariffs, fairly subsidized transportation improvements, and a national bank. His policies tended to favor the business elite of the Northeast and the entrepreneurs and commercial farmers of the Midwest, but it won little support from the South, from Southern planters and small-holding farmers who feared the powerful banks and imposed inflation resulting from the tariffs. Farmers, certainly of this era, and an idea that hangs around more or less actually to the present day, it's not an uncommon belief. The banks are kind of the enemy, but we see this a lot in this era of APUSH in particular, this era of American history, that farmers are very mistrustful of banks, and the administrations that push banks are suspected by farmers. It's an uneasy relationship. And I've explained that in class, and I can go over it again if we need to. But so Congress approved really only a few of Adams' proposals for internal improvements. Things like a short extension of the national road, because people thought that more or less an interstate highway system was beyond the scope of what the government should do. That should be the prerogative of the states. By far, the most far-reaching bill of the Adams administration came over the question of tariffs. His tariff of the 1824 protected manufacturers of New England and Pennsylvania against imports of more expensive woolen and cotton textiles, as well as iron goods. Disregarding Southern opposition, Northern Jacksonians joined with the supporters of Adams and Clay to enact the Tariff of 1828, which raised duties on raw materials, textiles, and iron goods. And the new tariff enraged the South. As the world's cheapest producer of raw cotton, the tariff cost Southern planters about $100 million a year, as planters had to buy either high-cost American textiles and iron goods or highly taxed British goods. Southerners thought the tariff was a legalized pillage and labeled it the Tariff of Abominations. Adams was the last of the elitist politicians and refused to adjust to his new style of party politics. He's basically the last of the old breed, the patrician class. He would, when he lost office, he actually didn't give up his political career. He's the only president that's done this. Went back to the House of Representatives and served out there, that patrician class. This picture on your right side of your screen, this is a much older John Quincy Adams, later in his life, but look at it carefully. John Quincy Adams lived into the era of photography. Welcome to our next technological piece of APUSH. Now we've entered the era of photography. It will still hang on with some painted portraits and whatnots, but actually seeing what the man looked like right there. John Quincy Adams. If you finish the slide, you may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you.